Hello, everyone. On Wednesday, Rachel Reeves laid out the Labour Party's first budget for Britain for 14 years. There were increases to public spending, relaxations to fiscal rules, and an increase in taxes to the tune of £40 billion. But what does all of this mean? Is it a decisive break with the 14 years of Conservative austerity that came before? To discuss these questions today, we're joined by Stephen Boyd, who is the director of the Institute for Public Policy Research in Scotland. Stephen, I guess to start, what did you make of the budget? What did you make of the headline announcements?
So I thought overall, relative to what we had been anticipating, it was a relatively positive budget. I think it's important to put it in context straight away. A colleague put it to me yesterday along the following lines. In 1997, Labour came into government and it was met with public services in a kind of parlous state, but the economy doing relatively well and the public finances in an okay state and getting better. In 2010, the Tories come in and they faced public services that were operating reasonably well and had benefited from a decade or more of pretty significant investment. But the public finances were deteriorating quite rapidly. But now Rachel Reeves has come into government and she's met with public services that are in a really bad state and public finances that are in a pretty bad state as well. So I think we have to recognise that there were quite significant constraints around about this budget. But within that, I think she has signalled a pretty decisive break with the past. We've seen, particularly over the next couple of years, very significant increases in public spending. And we've seen significant changes to the fiscal rules, which I think enable more public investment. I think which is certainly needed, and it's something that over the last decade chancellors have been kind of cutting. So I think overall there was a number of good things. The tax measures, IPPR had been looking for the chancellor to go a bit further, but they were generally in the right direction. So overall, probably net positive. Budgets are never perfect, as you know, but probably
Never
in net
perfect,
positive
never
territory, I think.
perfect. Do you think? Do you think she's done enough to fix the foundations? I'm conscious that was the message that they stressed during the general election campaign. It was about fixing broken Britain and doing the work that the Tories hadn't. And I mean, there is significant investment coming, particularly as you said, up until 2027, and then it drops off a bit. I wonder if there is enough to sort of meet these missions that they laid out in the general election campaign. What do you think? Do you think it goes far enough in that sense?
So it was interesting, the Scottish Government's response to the budget, which was generally quite positive, and they again recognised it was quite a significant and decisive break with the previous Tory administrations. But they did say that it wasn't sufficient to undo the negative effects of austerity. Now, I think that's true. Now, I think there's a huge question there about whether it was reasonable to expect one budget to do that, given we've had 14 years of very significant real terms cuts to public spending. We've seen public sector wages not rise. We've seen public investment massively cut. I don't think all of that can be unwound in one budget. I think what you're looking for is a significant change in direction. I think that was certainly delivered. The spending increases over the next couple of years are really significant. There's clearly challenges in that in terms of delivering that spending effectively over quite a short time frame, particularly on the investment side. But I think the government's hope will be that a couple of years of relatively very high spending will help to meet some of the very immediate pressures in public spending, which then should have a knock-on economic impact, and then might mean that budgets 2 or 3 years hence we might be in slightly more positive territory. Has it fixed the foundations? I think it's certainly moving in the right direction. Probably those foundations have been undermined to such an extent, I think, since 2010. I don't think it's feasible for one budget to correct them, but I think it's moving in the right direction. So I think in public investment, Britain's in a really poor place in investment because public investment was low and private investment's catastrophically low. So overall, investment has been really, really weak. So the economy kind of reflects that, years, decades, you could argue, of underinvestment. So I think the foundations on such a kind of creaky place that you need. I think I think what she has done is signal a very strong long-term commitment to the investment side, the public balance sheet, and I
Yeah.
think that's positive. So over time, you would hope those foundations would look stronger than they do at present, but will not be fixed by this one budget.
Do we know much yet about how the investment's going to be used? I'm conscious that when they talk about things like GB Energy, they talk about an investment arm and leveraging public investment to sort of subsidise offshore wind projects that the private sector haven't taken on, and it's not quite PFI because in the end, the offshore wind projects will still be owned by the private sector, but they will have a significant amount of public sector investment helping them along the way. Is that how we're expecting this new sort of £100 billion worth of public investment to manifest itself?
And I think the straightforward answer is we don't really know yet. I think
Yeah.
that detail will feed through. I mean, what the Chancellor did start to discuss, and I've not really managed to read up as closely on this as I would have liked, but she did announce some guardrails, as she described it, around about public investment, meant to ensure that this public investment is as well spent as it can be and has as big an economic impact as it can be. And those measures sounded in the headlines kind of broadly sensible, but quite how all that pans out in terms of specific projects, it's very difficult to say at the moment. There's then a whole set of other issues round about GB Energy and how that pans out. Lots of unanswered questions there. IPPR have actually just started a project on this at UK level to have a look at GB Energy and what it might do in the future. But
Mm-hmm.
whether or not what's planned for GB Energy really tells you very much about that whole other kind of
Yeah.
strand of public investment, I'm not entirely sure at this stage.
What did you make of the tax rises and the choices that they made? So national insurance for employers makes up a significant part of the 40 billion. I think 25 billion is going to come from NI contribution for employers. Do you think that tax in particular, will that eventually find its way to affecting wages, to driving down wages, do you think?
So I think overall the tax rises were broadly the right direction. I mean, IPPR had argued for the government to go further in capital gains, but that increase is kind of welcome as far as it goes. The removal of reliefs and inheritance tax,
Yeah.
I think, were very sensible moves. And interesting, you're already hearing those affected beginning to shout very loudly about that.
Yeah.
An awful lot of misinformation or inaccurate, I think, analysis of what that means. The employer national insurance, I think, is really interesting, and I think it's kind of been under discussed since the budget. So I guess if you're kind of looking back over the last 15 years or so, I guess we've worried in the UK that in many ways it's been kind of too easy to employ people in low wages. We've got very
Mm.
light employment regulation, we've got relatively light taxation on employment compared to other countries. And myself and many others have argued that this is kind of part of the UK's low productivity story because the incentive for many employers was to kind of operate what we would describe as low road competitive strategies. So they employ
Mm.
people in low wages, quite happy with kind of low skill, low productivity equilibrium. They still manage to generate sufficient profits, etc. But this changed to employer mix, allied to another significant increase in the national minimum wage, means you're seeing a really significant bump in the cost of employing someone proportionally at the lower end. So, proportionally, it's much
Yeah.
more expensive for an employer to employ someone on a minimum wage than it would be for an employer to employ someone on £60,000 a year. So, what does this mean for employment? What does it mean for businesses' competitive strategies? I mean, I guess our aspiration would be that employers will, start to kind of move up, towards the kind of higher road competitive strategy, based much more on investment, long-term investment in skills and R&D, etc. Whether or not it pans out like that, I don't know. It's a really interesting experiment, how this pans out.
Yeah.
Will it have an impact on the levels of employment, particularly at lower ends? But I don't know. I'm sceptical about that, but it'll be interesting to see. Will it force employers to kind of substitute capital for labour? And we've heard an awful lot about, technology destroying jobs. it's not really fed through in terms of the
Yeah.
productivity or employment statistics up until now. But will that be a spur to that kind of thing happening? And finally, getting back to your original point about wages, I think we do know that the incidence of employer mix will over time fall on employees rather than employers. So I think employees will not see an initial hit to their wages, and that will fall to the employer. But next year and the year after, when you come to wage negotiations, that increase will be reflected in the employer's demands, I'm sure, when it comes to kind of wage increase. So the OBR has been quite clear that it expects it to have a significantly negative impact on wages over the course of this parliament. Whether or not it pans out like that, there's a lot of other factors at play here. It's not just about employer mix, it's about the level of demand for labour out there in the economy, and worker
Yeah.
bargaining power, etc. So how all of that, plays out over the course of the parliament remains to be seen. But it's a really interesting area, actually. I mean, I guess in some ways, some of us are getting what we've kind of asked for in terms of a much higher minimum wage.
Hmm.
What that means for employment, for wages, for productivity going forward remains to be seen. But it's really worth keeping an eye on, I think.
I was I was really interested in it, right? Particularly because she didn't touch corporation tax at the same time, right? So because corporation tax stays where it is, I think it might even be frozen. And Rachel Reeves at the Dispatch Box boasts about how corporation tax is the lowest in the G7, and that's a good thing because it allows us to attract private investment. And then to go after Nix for employers, presumably with a more sizable knock-on effect on smaller businesses, while not touching corporation tax, goes some way undermining this narrative that they have going on about a budget for working people, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting
Yeah,
discussion there about where the incidence of corporation tax falls as well, and many would say that ultimately would fall in wages.
yeah,
So, yeah, I mean, this is one budget. It remains to be seen again, as I say, over the course of the parliament where all of this goes. Be interesting to see. I can understand. I mean, corporation tax has bumped about all over the place over the last few years. I don't think that's very good for anybody, actually. I mean, the Tories, after having slashed it, then very significantly increased it. So I can understand the pressures and the Chancellor wanting that to remain kind of steady for a couple of years or so. But yeah, I mean, if the incidence of all new tax was to fall very heavily on workers over the course of this
yeah.
parliament, that would not be a very good place to be.
Do you think? Because I guess the bit that we haven't talked about yet, there are like increases in national minimum wage a lot, maybe to protect workers in this budget. Do you think there is enough to protect more vulnerable people, right? Because that's what they didn't talk about. I think the Resolution Foundation had a stat out this morning that says there's going to be a £3.9 billion cut in welfare by 2029 total. It's a significant sum of money, right? And it comes, on top of winter fuel and obviously two child benefit cap staying in place. Was that the bit that was missing?
I think in many ways, yes. And you asked earlier on about the government's 5 missions and whether or not this budget was putting them in a good place to meet those missions. I mean, I think if they're going to always forget what the kind of social spending mission's called,
Mm-hmm.
opportunity for all or something, but I mean, if that's going to be delivered on through the course of this parliament, as well as the kind of quite stretching aspirations for child poverty, then it's very difficult to see that over the course of the parliament again. You wouldn't want to see significant action, particularly on the child limit and the benefit cap. Um, it's very difficult to see how the government can deliver on its aspirations without higher social spending. Now, I think they will hope that the measures they've announced will have an impact on growth, and that will begin to feed through, and people will see the benefit of that. I mean, I think the chances of that having a real impact on particularly reducing child poverty over the next few years without the kind of measures we've just been discussing, I think are quite slim. So certainly at future budgets, we would be looking for significant action in that area.
Mm-hmm. And what about the growth mission? Do you think this budget will grow the economy? I saw some OBR forecasts that looked sort of slightly sceptical, some small growth in the immediate years and then back to where we are now. Do you think they've done enough to sort of set the economy on a path to growth?
So it's really interesting. I mean, what the OBR are saying basically the next 2 years are significant boost to growth, through that higher spending and investment. Then it falls back in years 3, 4, and 5 of the forecast. But then from round about 2032, you're seeing the kind of longer term growth impact
Mm-hmm.
of the investment. So again, the impact becomes positive, which I think is all kind of sensible, and that makes absolute intuitive sense. I mean, I think there's a couple of things here. One is there's a kind of fallacy where people tend to think about, the growth in the UK economy being a function of budget measures. I mean, there's an awful lot else going on in the world than just what the UK government is doing,
Mm-hmm.
and what will ultimately, be the biggest determinant of its global economic conditions. If the global economy is doing okay, we're likely to benefit from that. If it's not, then we'll suffer from it. So I think the government can just try and do the right things and hope it gets some benefit of that. I mean, the problem is in the kind of supply side of the economy, governments can do the right things. The chances of them seeing the benefit of that over the 5 year parliamentary term are very, very slim, and I think that's why the OBR is correct in saying what it is, what it's doing. I mean, I think investment is the most important thing. I mean, the UK economy has suffered massively from a deficit in investment. So if the government is properly doing as much as it can to redress that, you should see a positive impact in growth. But whether or not with everything else that's going on, that feeds through to a higher GDP figure year on year. Really, it's not the government's gift. It really depends on what's happening elsewhere. So I think some of the
Yeah,
things
yeah.
they're doing broadly sensible. Um, but whether or not they will see the benefit of that in time for the next election, I think is very doubtful.
You mentioned the increased public investment there, and I'm conscious that one of the things we haven't touched on yet is this relaxation of fiscal rules, which you wrote about in the Herald earlier this week about the need for those rules to be relaxed. How significant is that, and what does it suggest about Rachel Reeves' thinking? Right? It's interesting that after the election these rules have been relaxed. Is it coming into office realizing that there's this £20 billion black hole and realizing you have to do something about it, or is it something more than that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily about relaxation as such. I think it's just about a better measure. I mean, how should we measure
Mm-hmm.
government's assets and liabilities going forward and, design a debt target around about that? So I think moving to public sector net financial liabilities, which it does at least recognise the financial on the government's balance sheet is sensible. It did provide some more headroom for investment, and I think that is right. So I mean, as we had before, a fiscal rule that basically mitigated against the government investing for the country's future doesn't really make much sense. So I think it's definitely a move in the right direction. IPPR had argued that the measure would be in public sector net worth and it provided a bit more additional headroom, and I would argue is a better accounting of overall assets and liabilities. But it's definitely a move in the right direction. I think there's, I think having changed the rules, it probably makes sense to stick with them, albeit we think they're a bit imperfect. I mean, I think constantly changing the fiscal rules it's not great, I mean, it's not great from a financial market, view of the world, which doesn't really worry me that much. But from a kind of trust in democracy and you know,
Yeah.
the voters not believing that governments are just going to shift the fiscal rules to meet their own interests. I think that's much more important. So I think it's definitely a move in the right direction. Will allow the government to invest more for the country's future, which is good. But I think we should probably stick with that for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. And what about Scotland then? I was interested to see Shona Robinson had welcomed it as a step in the right direction, which is something you haven't seen much over the last 14 years. Uh, is the budget good news for the Scottish government?
I think in the short term, it absolutely is. It's more money. It makes our life easier over the next couple of years. I think, in the final years of the forecast, as we've already discussed, it's likely to become much tighter again. So I mean, at UK level, there's total increase in public spending factored in of 1.3% for years 3, 4, and 5. And that's not good. And if you're going to protect kind of health there, that implies really, really tight settlements for other departments. So I mean, that's, I can understand the Scottish Government having some concerns about that. But in the short term, that should ease a lot of the very pressing and immediate concerns been facing Scotland this year and next. It doesn't overcome all challenges. What I would hope all this spurs is a kind of longer term discussion in Scotland about kind of fiscal sustainability and fairness, which I think we've kind of been avoiding.
Mhm.
What's interesting, there's a lot of talk at UK level about the taxation burden that's always presented in that pejorative language, being the highest ever in UK level. Actually, what you're seeing across the developed world is total tax revenues, which is my better way, the way I prefer to put it, are rising pretty much
Mhm.
everywhere. And they're doing so mainly due to demographics, and there's a lot of kind of COVID hangover in there as well. But when my kind of argument is always, you look at the big challenges that all societies are going to face through the 21st century, so demographics, the net zero transition, technological change, whatever, all of them imply significantly more government spending. I mean, total tax revenues across all countries are only going in one direction. They're going to go up.
Mhm.
Now we need to kind of engage with that reality. And if I think about what our tax and spend system looks like going forward, I think the kind of, I mean, is it the dominant view? I don't know. But certainly the view in much of kind of Scottish policy circles is there are clever things we can do out there to reduce public spending. I just don't, there's always clever things you can do, but, really it's at the margin. Public spending is only going to go one way up. The public sector is concerned with delivering highly labour intensive personal services and health, education and social care. We know through all countries and all times the cost of delivering these services rises above the whole economy rate of inflation, which is just a matter of major productivity in these sectors being intrinsically lower because they're labour intensive. So I mean the costs that are going to rise, and those challenges are going to be exacerbated by demographics and environmental transition. So we have to engage with that reality, and I think in Scotland we can certainly be doing much more than we've been doing up until now to have a proper, mature debate around about those issues. But we've got
Yeah,
significant taxation powers in Scotland. There's always a debate about getting more, but there's certainly more we can do to design a tax and spend system that's fit to meet those challenges of the 21st century.
yeah, that's really interesting, right? Because one of the things I've been wondering is whether, off the back of this, it allows for a longer term view, right? Can we move away from the short termism which has plagued the British economy for the last 14 years and longer? Um, and it's, as Rachel Reeves was at the dispatch box, you had this news from Spain, right? And these floods which have killed 150 plus people, right? The biggest catastrophic weather event this close to home in my lifetime, right? And the question then becomes, has she laid out a vision which can insulate the British economy against these shocks and transition us in a fair way to net zero as part of that mission? Um, so yeah, do you think we are now in a position where we are better placed to think long term about industrial strategy off the back of that budget?
I would hope so. I would be reticent about being too positive about that. I mean, we've been here many times in the past. I mean, you're saying short-termism's dominated the UK economy the last 14 years. I mean, you could say the last 100 years, certainly in the private economy. I
Yeah.
mean, the incentives on UK employers to invest longer term have always been weak relative to other countries. Um, so I think the budget, I think by signaling that long-term commitment to public investment, I think that's really important, but there's then the secondary question, is that investment sufficient to meet the scale of the challenges that we face in the future? And probably not. I think it would be unfair to expect that from one budget, particularly a government that's just 3 months in the door. So they're heading in the right direction, but clearly there is a long road to travel there, as
Mhm.
there is in Scotland as well. There's been all manner of, I started working at the STC almost exactly 20 years ago, and there's been so many kind of big events in that kind of intervening period or up to the STC and the Scottish Government, now IPPR, that have appeared to kind of provide a really good opportunity to have this kind of longer term discussion. It's never really happened, to be honest, you know. So I would hope this is another opportunity to kind of be having that debate, and we'll certainly be doing what we can to provoke that debate with government and others. But we can't postpone it indefinitely. I mean, I think that the UK total tax revenues now at the highest level ever as a proportion of GDP are heading towards that level. I think increasing recognition that this is kind of a common trajectory with other countries, I think should make people a bit more comfortable with having that, recognising that, tax as a proportion of GDP is only going to go one way. So how do we as a country best handle that? And what kind of tax and spend system do we need in there? And that involves us, I think all of us addressing some kind of shibboleth. So I mean, my favourite one I like to say to people is, that will involve regressive taxation being a major part of that system. People very often kind of turn away from that. When we look at the tax and spend systems that work best in Nordic nations, I mean, they levy VAT of 25% upwards and they levy on everything, but it's a really good tax and it provides high and stable revenues, which those systems then use for redistribution around the economy, so we need to start confront some of these issues that we don't often in Scotland. I think we've kind of avoided talking about. We need a tax and spend system that works. That might involve regressive taxes being a big part of that system. But the tax and spend system overall should be progressive. But we just need that much more deeper and much more nuanced conversation than we've had up until now, I think.
Yeah. It was interesting from a climate point of view in planning for the just transition, some of the sort of more minor announcements, right? So that bus fare hike of 50%, and then freezing fuel duty doesn't do much for inspiring confidence in public transport use in the coming years. I guess returning to the bigger picture, because we've only got a couple of minutes before we finish off. Do you think that broadly then that in the case of climate, a good budget for climate, a good budget for long termism, that public investment is good if undetailed? It strikes me that there's a lot of sort of things that we don't yet know, right? A lot of big ticket items that sound quite good on paper, but that are undefined, and that might yet skew quite badly in the wrong direction. A sort of concluding general impression of yours, I guess, to finish off.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of climate, I mean, it's never going to be sufficient, is it? I mean, I try to be glass half full when it comes to budgets, and I think that strong commitment to longer term public investment. I mean, I think every chancellor that's been met with really difficult fiscal challenge over the last 15 years has chosen to attack public investment. So I think that kind of signal that we just can't keep doing this, I think, is really important and should have an impact on climate change, depending on we see how some of this money is going to be spent. I think the fuel duty thing is becoming a bit of embarrassment, not just to this chancellor, but just to kind of good governance in the UK. I mean, I think it's still, there'll be as projections still factor in removal of the 5% cut, year on year. I mean, it's just becoming farcical. But I think, it's not just about that fuel duty, is it? I mean, it's about a taxation regime that is fit for the challenges and, meeting the future, which taxes environmental bads and incentivises environmental goods, so we do some things that nod in that direction, but the system overall is not really fit for meeting the challenge of climate change. So I think there's much more to do there. I mean, overall, very big picture, it was a better budget than I was expecting. I think a lot of good things were in there. I think there's some really interesting things. I think the employer costs kind of the lower end of the wage distribution is going to be really interesting to watch how all that pans out in terms of jobs, wages, and productivity. I'm really interested in that. But a lot, a lot more distance to travel over the course of this parliament if the government's 5 missions are going to be met.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll leave it there.